Those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Sarah Boyce. I'm the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. This is tracking seasonal changes, looking at phenology and Nature's Notebook, and we'll explain what those things are if you're not familiar with them. This is part of a community science workshop series where we're talking about different ways to be involved in community science. We're based on Nantucket, but I know that people, because we're on Zoom, you can be anywhere. So we're going to talk a lot about spring and phenology on Nantucket, but I hope that you have some takeaways for where you are. I wanted to mention community science generally. If you've been to some of the other workshops, this slide is familiar to you. I just like to start out so that we're all on the same page. When we talk about community science, sometimes called citizen science, it's a way for people to learn about science and the world through meaningful participation. And it's participating at your comfort level. There's lots of different ways to participate in science. There's more passive and there's more active. And so this series has been meant to kind of introduce you to different ways that we use community science at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, and hopefully ways that you can be involved. So the series, this is the fourth one, I think. Yeah. So we've already done eBird, we had Kokoraz, which is looking at precipitation collection. We had last month, we had an iNaturalist talk. Today, we're doing Nature's Notebook and phenology. And then just a heads up for our last one, which is going to be in May, on May 19th, we're going to talk about non-native invasive species and the EDMAPS, which is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, which is one of the ways that we track invasive species. If you haven't, or if you're interested in any of these, they were all recorded. And so you can go to llnf.org and watch the YouTube videos of the talks. This is a screenshot of the iNaturalist one. And if you have any questions, you can always shoot me an email. Okay, so our strategy for tonight, I'm going to talk about what is phenology and the nature's timing. We're going to talk about some climate change impacts. We're going to introduce Nature's Notebook, which is a citizen science application, basically how we record things like phenology. And then I'm going to touch on how the Linda Loring Nature Foundation uses Nature Notebook, how we use it in our research and our outreach and communication. And we're going to talk about how to get involved in kind of next steps. So while we do use, we do a lot of research on phenology and use Nature's Notebook, we're going to touch on it. It's not going to be a full research talk here, so just to prepare you. So when I say phenology, phenology is the science of seasons. There's a lot of different ways to define it, but it's basically the science of studying nature's timing. And just at the very kind of surface level, it's looking at things like blooms and budding, hibernation, migration, emergence, different life cycles or timings, or like different events across the life cycle. And then how all of these events, these natural events, are related to some kind of environmental condition. And so there's lots of different types of phenology. There's lots of different things we can measure and record and look at and investigate. So the springtime is a great time to talk about phenology. I do lots of like field trips or class talks with middle school and high schoolers at this time of year, because springtime is when a lot of events happen, right? So we see, these are some signs of spring from, actually from April of 2020, when I had lots of time to go out and take pictures. But we think of the cinnamon fern emerging, ribbon snakes and other things that have been dormant for this season kind of becoming more active. We found some redback salamanders. Like there's, we often think of spring as nature awakening. So even if you don't know what phenology is, or you haven't thought about it before, everyone has made observations as the seasons change, and especially in an area like New England, where we do have, kind of relatively strong seasons. I know that we're all anxious for spring and looking for those signs of spring. And signs of spring actually can be data points. And so that's part of the quantitative part of phenology. There's the qualitative part where we can observe changes, whether it's something blooming and maybe a flower bud opening, changing of color of leaves and flowers maturing. And then the timing of those things is the quantitative part, the data part. And so it's not just something emerging or something visible like that. There's also behavior changes. So a lot of birders, birding is very popular where we are in Nantucket, and bird migration. So birds coming back to the area after being away for the wintertime. And so the timing of arrivals, but also behavior changes. So northern harriers, which we have all winter long at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, their behavior changes with the season. So they're changing their courtship behaviors, they're getting ready to breed and nest making. And so that behavior change is a sign of spring and is a data point. We have the spring migrants coming in. So this Baltimore Oriole coming to a feeder, and as the spring migrants come through, that's another data point where think of every time on there's the social media pages for Nantucket birding or the birding article in the newspaper, when anyone notices these new birds coming back to the area. If you're not a bird watcher, you might be a dog walker or a person that walks out in nature and might be hearing the red-winged blackbirds and other displays and vocalizations as behavior changes with the spring. Osprey returning, I mentioned migratory birds. We know that there's sort of an unofficial contest for who sees witnesses the first osprey's return to the island. I think it was March 22nd this year that Karen Beatty from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation saw the first ospreys returning over at windswept Cranberry Bog. And then there's the sounds of spring as well. So once again, behavior changes, like the American woodcock, their breeding calls, you can be heard at dusk. Spring peepers, there has been efforts to quantify spring peeper calls and relating them to temperature. Here on Nantucket, that's mostly anecdotal, the first, who hears the first spring peepers and where on the island. There's insect emergence, there's spring pollinators. So there's lots of different ways that we can kind of witness these things or think about the things that we already pay attention to in the springtime and then start to think of those as important data points. And then the other part of it I like to think about is, what are people interested in? So I'm interested in nature, so that's the first thing I go to. And there's birding, there's gardening, there's lots of different ways we can think about what phenology is and thinking of the seasons, but we also think of our commercial and recreational fisheries. I have a lot of anglers in my family, so I love this On the Waters striper migration map because it shows this was from April 23rd of last year, but it shows the different, the migration of the striped bass from the south to the north, but it also relates that to the water temperatures, because that's an important part of phenology is migration or a natural event as it relates to an environmental variable. And we're changing our behaviors as our phenology changes. And so every year, once again, another contest related to phenology is who's going to catch the first keeper striped bass of the year. In 2020, this was our friend Dave Bell, so I always have to put this in because he was very proud of his catch. And I think that, as we're looking at this year, so this is from April 1st, so just about a week ago, the water temperature is a lot colder. We're not even close to having any striper action out here in Nantucket. But you think of how our behavior changes as we're thinking, the changing phenology is changing our behavior. So we can use, nature as a guide. We think of the timing of natural events affects the timing of the fishing season. So when the state puts the fishing regulations up, timing of festivals. So we have the Daffodil Festival in Nantucket. Is always at the last weekend in April. And if you're on Nantucket and you've driven around at all, you know that the daffodils are just about at peak bloom right now in many areas. And so what's going to happen by the time the daffodil festival happens? And so do we need to move our daffodil festival based on the timing of our blooms? It's supposed to say cherry blossoms, but it says cheery blossoms, which I guess is also, they are quite cheery, but cherry blossom festivals are a culturally significant festival that's based around the peak blooming of cherry blossoms. Phenology can also tells us when to plant things, when to harvest them. So this is all phenology, and these are all sources of data. So when we quantify phenology, we're looking at observations through the seasons. So let's say in this example, one specific tree, like this red maple, and you make observations throughout the season, noting what's happening to the tree and the date. And so the date is kind of the significant data point that correlates to what's happening with the tree. But then we relate it to an environmental variable, often temperature. So there's like lots of different climatic variables that are cues for the thing that you're studying, whether it's a plant or an insect, an animal behavior, to go through that change. So many cases, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about is actually temperature. And temperature, and because of this relationship, phenology has become more of a popular research topic as we are looking at evidence of climate change and how we can look at, not only is the temperature changing, but what the evidence for impact to our species. And so, just to be all on the same page, we know that our temperatures are warming, but they're not warming uniformly across the country or across the world. So New England air temperatures are warming faster than many other areas of the country. Our ocean warm water is also warming at different rates, and in the Gulf of Maine, which includes Nantucket, Gulf of Maine sea surface temperatures are warming at a faster rate than many other parts of the country. And then precipitation is also highly variable, more difficult to predict with climate change, but we have seen in the last 50 years a 10% increase in precipitation, in Massachusetts. And it, isn't a uniform increase in precipitation. It's more variable and episodic. So, these environmental changes are also all impacting or can have impact on our phenology. And so I start to think about where we are on Nantucket and what the ecological, economic, and cultural impacts might be with these, changing climates. So the increasing temperature, changing water temperatures, and changing precipitation. How do those things, or do they affect things like bird migration, the recreational commercial fisheries, our daffodil festival timing, our native plants flowering and fruiting, insect emergence, whether they're native insects or pest species, and invasive species leafing out and flowering. So all these different things that I care about as an ecologist, as a land manager, how are all these things being affected by climate change? And so, this is where the phenology data collection really comes into play, because we are looking at, we can look at now, since recorded time, we can look at temperature differences, but we don't have, we can look to historic data sets for phenological observations to give us insight into long-term patterns of climatic change. And one of the most well-known and long-term phenological data sets is from Kyoto, Japan. So I already mentioned that cherry blossoms are culturally significant, and so peak flowering time has been recorded since about 800 AD. And in that time, about almost, over close to 2,000 years, I guess, there is recorded observations of peak flowering time. And we can look at that historic data set and match the change of peak flowering time to temperature, and look at and understand, or what we can see from today's data is that on average, these cherry blossoms are flowering 10 days earlier since recording began. And when you look at this red trend line, you can see that actually the decrease of the line means that flowering is happening earlier, and that's really in just the last about 100 years that that's been happening. Similarly, we look at the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C., also, very significant for our cherry blossom festivals in DC. And recording began there in 1921 by the National Park Service. And since then, the cherry blossoms have been at peak about 5 days earlier since recording began. So we can use these historical data sets to look at how the climate has been to have as an indicator of climate change, and how our plants may be responding. And so when we look at the historical data set, you can then take that and then make projections into the future. Similarly, in Massachusetts, once again, investigating these historic data sets, Richard Premack and Abe Miller-Rushing looked at notebooks from Henry David Thoreau, who observed many different flowering plants in Massachusetts around Walden Pond. And Premack and Miller-Rushing went back to some of the same areas, re-recorded all the phenological observations, and found that a lot of our Massachusetts native wildflowers were flowering about 7 days earlier than average. And so we can, these have been really rich data sets for early on looking, I say early on, in the last 15, 20 years, have been some of the richest data sets for looking at impacts for climate change. But we want to move beyond just the historic data sets. That's if you find that treasure trove of like the perfect historic data set, that's really a rich source to then reinvestigate where we're at now and then look at how a species might be responding to climate change. But then how do we collect new data for phenology? And so this is where the National Phenology Network comes in. If you've heard me talk before about some of the other community science applications, it's kind of got a similar history. A group of people were really interested in unifying the different types of research around phenology and the types of data collection, because we know that there's more power in lots of people collecting the same data that can be put together to ask these really big picture questions, especially around climate change. So the National Phenology Network was founded in 2007, and it was, done in an effort to collect and share phenological data and distribute information about phenology. So kind of like some of the other applications I've talked about before, the first steps were to have uniform data collection protocols, uniform training for all researchers and community science volunteers. The National Phenology Network also produces a list of target species and projects to assist researchers so that it focuses volunteers on certain species of interest. It is community science based. There's lots of input from researchers. And then within the National Phenology Network, there's lots of data exploration tools and analysis, and they provide a lot of visualization tools. And I'll show you a few of those, but it's a really rich, rich website to investigate. So like many of the other applications, actually signing up is super easy. If you've, in this day and age of everybody having access to the internet and having your phone and things like that, a lot of these things are really easy. So basically you just sign up to join Nature's Notebook, all basic information and things like that. And then, different than some other things, you actually have to select a site. So if you're interested in collecting these type of data or making observations on a plant, a lot of times the best way to start is to look at something in your yard. And so you just want to mark a plant. It can be like, these are just some examples of types of markers. People have like little wooden stakes. We have little metal tags that have, we write the number of the plant and the species name. You can have flagging tape, whatever. It's just marking a plant. And you add some information on the website about where the plant is. So you choose a site and you choose a plant, because those are important data points. So the location of the plant or animal is really important, the species, and choosing, there's a list of plants of interest. And if anyone does want to pursue this further, I'm happy to be a guide for what might be interesting. But I also want people to, I want it to be something that you'd want to observe yourself. And so for us at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, I'll talk about it in a little bit about the plants we chose, but basically we chose common native plants that are shrubs. They're easy to tag and they stay in one place. They're easy to kind of point volunteers to that are helping collect data. And also it was an important part of our research questions. And then basically you go out and start observing. There's no requirement as to how often you observe. It's great to observe multiple times during the season. Because we have a kind of more rigorous research project that we're looking at, we observe at least once a week. But we, in the peak of the growing season, we try to observe more times. But it's really as a volunteer and just doing something of interest, you can just do it a few times during each season. This is a version of the paper data sheet, which is, I like to use paper data sheets because I'm a stickler for the data integrity. But basically you can see on the far left, there's an area where you put the date and the time of observation. Those are, the date is the most important data point. And then you write down all the different things you see. Do you see breaking leaf buds, leaves, colored leaves, which would be something in the fall, flowers, fruits, etc. And then if you do find anything, and then if you say yes to any of these, then there's an amount. And I'm not going to go into the details of the protocol, but basically it's all very spelled out in any of these data sheets. So if you find a huckleberry leaf, then and you say yes, the amount would be, there's like ranges. You don't have to count every single leaf. It's more like, are there 3 to 10? Are there 10 to 20, etc. This is what the online data entry looks like. It looks exactly like the data sheet. So it's really easy to enter online. And then of course, like most things, there's a phone application that it's for iPhones, Androids, tablets, etc. So I personally use the paper data sheets and have our interns use the paper data sheets, but a lot of people really enjoy using the app too. And then it just automatically enters the phenology observation, into the database. And as I mentioned, the National Phenology Network has really great visualization tools. They just updated and did a huge overhaul in the last probably year. So there's lots more ways to explore the data that are available than I'm familiar with. So you can look at maps, you can look at models, you can look at data from specific areas or certain species across the whole country. One thing I really like is if you look at visualizations, the National Phenology Network has a few what they call seasonal stories, and they are questions that they have already kind of pre-asked. And so as data are entered in real time, they all feed into these questions. So if you want to look at any of them, here, I'll give an example. So this map is called the Spring Leaf Index Return Interval, which basically means over the years that National Phenology Network has been collecting these data, they're seeing how early spring is. So in any given year, springtime temperatures and the responses of plants might be happening earlier and earlier or later and later, or just kind of the average of a 30-year period. They have enough data now to not only show how early something is happening, but how often early is. And this map shows that the lighter green means that earlier springs are becoming more and more frequent. And that has been a prediction of climate change, especially in New England, is that our springs are arriving earlier. We're having shorter winters. And we kind of know that anecdotally and feel it. What we're seeing is these large national data sets are starting to show that. And so what we're seeing is not only are we experiencing early springs, but we're experiencing early springtime temperatures more and more frequently. It's becoming the normal. So, so this previous map was actually from last September, but it was an amalgamation of like the last 5 years of data. So over the last 5 years, how frequently are we having early spring? And so just to go over a few different types of maps, but these are really related. This first map here is just from the other day, from 2 days ago. And this asks, how early is spring right now? And what it does is it shows the data that are coming into the National Phenology Network, as well as all the climatic data are kind of put together in this model. And the darker the red, the earlier spring is from normal. And the bluer is later, springtime temperatures are later than normal. And so this is just a 1 year snapshot. We know that 1 year doesn't make a trend, right? What could be just a weird year. And so this one is from this year. And so right now we're seeing that Nantucket, Cape Cod, you might be able to see a little bit easier up here, is bright red. So we know that we're pretty early springtime right now compared to historic averages. And then this map probably looks a little bit like the last one, where the lighter the green means we're having more frequent early spring. So the first one is how early is spring, and the second one is how frequent have we been having early springs. There's also lots of other maps about growing degree days, making predictions for certain species. There's just a lot to explore. But the next piece I want to talk about is what we do at Linda Loring Nature Foundation. And I really think before I get into exactly what we do, I wanted to take a step back and think about the role generally of nature centers and land trusts in phenology observations. So I mentioned like a lot of the early research was looking for historic data sets and then retaking the same data from long ago. And that helps show a long-term trend in things. So we look at bird migrations, we look at plants leafing out, plants blooming, things people have recorded. And the role of many nature centers and land trusts is to make these observations, record them, and then communicate them out. And a really great example is Aldo Leopold's phenological observations from the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Aldo Leopold Foundation maintains the records from Aldo Leopold, who wrote down the arrival dates of hundreds of migratory bird species, nesting times, many plant observations. And then today, the Aldo Leopold Foundation holds on to that legacy and continues that data set. So it becomes this long-term data set that has been a really rich data set to be used for climate change observations. And so we hope to kind of emulate that. And I think that's something that a lot of nature centers and land trusts can do by starting to collect data that could be meant to be a long-term data set. So we have observations of tree swallow occupation of our nest boxes. And I'm going to talk about some of our plant observations as well. So for Linda Loring Nature Foundation, we started to ask these research questions. Okay, so we know that New England is warming. We know that springtime temperatures are predicted to continue to be earlier and earlier. So how are these temperatures affecting the Nantucket flora? What's our baseline? Do we have a normal phenology that we can look at, quote unquote normal, so we can note changes as they might be happening? Is there any vulnerability of our species to early spring? And are there sort of winners and losers in warming temperatures? I mean, do they all respond the same? Are they unique? And I'm not going to go into the whole entire research project, but I just wanted to show you the types of research questions that we ask and how phenological observations can help us answer some of these questions. So as I mentioned before, we chose common native shrubs to take data on for this project. These are dominant species on our landscape. Shrubs are easy for tagging and directing volunteers and students to. This project not only serves as a research project, but as a point of conversation about climate change. And we use this project in a lot of educational groups with students, as I mentioned, independent researchers, and volunteers. So these is some of our species that we're studying. We also study the eastern tent caterpillar. So eastern tent caterpillars emerge and hatch in the early spring, and they're very sensitive to temperature. And in other parts of the country, they're also used as kind of indicators of climate change because they are so responsive to temperature. And we had some students from the new school, they were 8th graders who were really interested in the tent caterpillars in 2015 or 2016. And so we added them to our observations. And just to go back to the type of data we collect, we look at leaves, flowers, and fruits. every time we go out, we record yes or no for these different phenophases. And then anything that's a yes, we record how many. And this is just, I wanted to show a few photos of what this looks like in the field. So this little branch you're seeing kind of above the data sheet is a black cherry, one of our most common species on the island generally, but also as part of our observations. And you can see those tight little green buds. So that's a green bud. It's not leafing out yet. So this would be a no, but it's close. And then a few days later, maybe a week later, this is the same branch. And this is, you can see this leaf bud has popped open. So this would be called breaking leaf bud, where you can see the tips of the leaves kind of opening up. And that, to me, that's the most true sign of spring, is when those leaf buds pop open. As I mentioned before, a lot of phenological study relates these events, these natural events, to some kind of environmental cues, and often climatic variables. So these are just some of the environmental data that we collect. We collect air temperature using these little data loggers. So if you're out on the trail and you see that white housing thing, this picture, inside that is a little data logger, and it records air temperature every hour. We also have one buried that collects soil temperature. We take site-specific precipitation. So an earlier workshop we did on the COCORA's Citizen Science Program, which is about precipitation data collection. So that's the rain gauge you see here. And then we also have things like that are unchanging, like elevation, soil type, et cetera. So these are all variables that we can look at when we try to correlate to phenological observations. Here are just some of the other visuals I want you to get, since we're not in the field right now. This is our low bush blueberry. It's always one of the first to leaf out, and so always one of the first to flower as well. We have bayberry, and this is a male bayberry on the far left. And this is actually just about to release pollen. So that's another phenological event during pollen release. Beach plum is unique because it flowers before it leaves out. So at this point, you can see these flower buds are about to pop open. And then my favorite, the eastern tent caterpillar. This is what the eggs look like right now. They were laid last July, and they are hard and black. Here, a close up. As the temperature warms, the black outer casing kind of fluffs off, and you can see the white eggs underneath. And then this is like May of last year, so early May, the caterpillars hatch. These are the tiny baby caterpillars, very sensitive to temperature. And this is what they become by like end of May to June. There'll be these tent caterpillars. So these are highly studied in as kind of canaries in the coal mine for climate change, because they are so responsive to temperature. So one of the products that we get from studying or recording phenology on these species is what we call a phenology calendar. And basically it's this kind of screenshot, if you will, is for breaking leaf buds. So that, this picture shows when the leaves first pop open. And so it shows two things. It shows when things first happen, and then it also shows the breadth of how long they happen for. And so this is what I would call like the baseline. So the order of the species leafing out, when they first happen in the year, and then also how long they happen for. And what our goal is to build this robust early data set so that as the warming happens that we expect to see, and as spring happens earlier and earlier, we'll see if there are changes to this calendar, if the order of operations change, if things leaf out earlier, if things leaf out later, and also if the breadth of leafing out changes at all. So we also ask things like, what are the ecological drivers for each of these species? So some of the drivers that are being investigated are spring temperatures, winter temperatures, growing degree days, which is another way of looking at temperature accumulation, soil temperature and precipitation, I already mentioned. And then once we find the drivers for each of these species that like drive that leaf out, then we can make predictions about how the species will change as these factors change. That's our goal. I don't have the answers just yet for you, but that's what we're working towards. We're also looking for things like evidence of ecological mismatch. So when I say ecological mismatch, we're looking at species that are reliant on each other. And if one changes in response to climate change, but the others don't, there can be a mismatch in how these species work together. So we're looking at things like how the eastern tent caterpillar, which relies on the black cherry for food, how that relationship is maintained or not with climate change. So the next step for us with this type of research is continuing to build that robust baseline. So continually collect our field data and start to look at any patterns of change. We're also been adding experiments here and there to kind of force some of that change. We did a twig warming experiment for several years and to kind of force the effects of climate change and how our different species would respond. And I'm continuing to look, in taking field observations, we're kind of taking advantage of natural conditions. And so it's once again, maintaining this longer term data set. And then we're interested in which species are going to be vulnerable to late frost. So I'm kind of interested in adding some experiments looking at potential frost effects, which would be kind of cool. And so I'm interested in how, there's lots of different ways people can participate. So there's people that want to volunteer with us and participate and look at what our research plants are and maybe take some data. If people are interested in your own yard, I know Deborah was talking about some interesting kind of out of season flowering observations. I think those are great to kind of adopt a tree or shrub in your own yard and either record officially or unofficially kind of record what happens throughout the year with those species. And then you can, especially in your own yard, it's really an interesting way to look at over time how things change, what's annual variation, like how much it changes within a year, and then year to year, how much that changes. I think about that a lot myself for my own garden. I am a great observer of the natural world. I am a terrible gardener. I want things to just do their own thing. And so, but I think how different it is every year in terms of like when we plant in the spring and how long our season can extend for what we're able to harvest. Also looking for natural events or signs of spring in your favorite places. So maybe it's not a tree, the same tree you visit, but the same property you walk your dog at every year. And when do you first hear the peepers? And when do you see the osprey come back to the pole? So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of start to notice that. And the only other thing I want to mention here too is that, I talked about the National Phenology Network and their offshoot program, which is called Nature's Notebook. But if you were present at our last workshop or know the program iNaturalist, iNaturalist is another way of collecting phenology observations. And if you're interested in something which might be a little easier of just taking a picture of something and submitting it, if you're not familiar with iNaturalist, I would suggest maybe like checking out our workshop from last month, because it's another way people really researchers use iNaturalist data for their phenology as well. So they might be looking for every flowering blueberry, let's say, in an area. And that is still important phenological data that you took that picture at a certain time. And I think that's all I have for tonight. I hope that you are interested in making observations about the natural world, thinking about phenology and how it relates to our climate, our changing temperatures. And I'm always also interested if anyone knows of any historic data sets around Nantucket where we can look at our own phenological history of data. That would be a really cool thing to build for Nantucket, a historic phenological data set. And with that, I think if there's any questions, or if there's any interest in exploring anything a little more in depth, I kind of wanted to give a brief over of a lot of the work that we're doing on phenology. So thank you. All right, oh, and if there's any questions later, I do have my contact information on here too. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. All right. Well, there's just a few of us, so if you guys have any questions, you can just shoot me questions. Or if you, so Deborah, I did want to tell you, so some of those blueberry plants I mentioned, those were, blueberry is one of the earliest plants to leaf out. So part of its plant strategy is that anytime there's a little bit of warmth, it's like, I'm ready. Like that's just, it's an early one. And so because of that plant strategy, if there's an unseasonable, like warm stretch, like we've seen in, December or something that we were, as an example, that blueberry is like, oh, it's spring. And so it gets ready. And if that happens, historically, there'll be like weird warm years, right? Like just a random warm year. And as a woody plant, one weird year isn't going to bother. It's like, oh, whoops, I went a little early. But what the problem we're seeing is that with climate change, we're seeing those weird warm years happen way more frequently. And so if it happens over and over and over again, that poor blueberry plant is going to run out of resources, because it's like, I flowered and bloomed in July and I made blueberries. And then I tried to do it again in December. It didn't work out. So then the next year it tries it again, and it's like, that's where there's a potential like detriment to the plants, is when they're just exhausting their resources by there's not enough downtime, because these plants have all evolved to have winter, right? So I was just thinking about that when we were talking about, it's like, it's kind of fun in like December when you're like, oh, look at daffodil. You're like, it's nice. But you think about if it happens over and over and over again, like there's kind of a consequence to that, those kinds of things. So. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. As I mentioned, we will be posting the recording, probably, if not tomorrow, early next